Tonight, you'll pull a shirt over your head without thinking about it. You'll zip a jacket. You'll tug on socks in the dark, half asleep, barely aware your hands are moving. It feels automatic. It feels like nothing. But the real answer to why you do this is far stranger than you think. You assume clothes exist because bodies get cold. That seems obvious. Humans have thin skin. Winters are brutal. Case closed, right? Except your body was never built to need clothes at all. You lost nearly all your fur somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, long before anyone sewed a single stitch. So for hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors walked around a hostile, freezing world with nothing but bare skin. How did they survive that gap? Here's where it gets strange. Genetic research points to something unexpected. In 2011, biologist Mark Stoking studied the DNA of human body lice. Body lice are different from head lice. They can only survive in clothing, nesting in the fibers, not on skin. So Stoking's team asked a clever question. When did body lice evolve as a separate species? The DNA clock gave an answer, somewhere around 170,000 years ago. That's the number. That's when clothing likely began. Not a cave painting. Not a tool. A parasite told the story humans forgot to write down. Before you get to that number, though, there's a bigger question sitting underneath it. Why did you lose your fur in the first place? Most mammals in your climate kept theirs. Losing thick body hair sounds like giving up armor for nothing. But researchers studying human thermoregulation point to sweating as the real reason. Bare skin lets sweat evaporate directly off the surface of your body, cooling you far more efficiently than fur ever could. That mattered enormously for early hominins hunting on hot, open savanna, chasing prey across long distances in the heat of the day. Losing fur wasn't a mistake. It was a trade. You gave up insulation to gain a built-in cooling system, one that let your ancestors outlast animals that were faster than them but overheated far sooner. The problem is that trade only works in warm weather. The moment your ancestors pushed into colder regions, or the moment temperatures dropped at night even in warm places, that same bare skin became a liability instead of an advantage. Clothing had to fill the gap evolution left behind. Think about the timeline for a second. Modern humans, the version of you walking around today, existed for tens of thousands of years without regular clothing. Your ancestors were naked, cold, and exposed, and they still made it. Why? The answer isn't willpower. It's fire. Controlled fire gave early humans a portable pocket of warmth they could carry into freezing nights. Shelter helped too. Caves, windbreaks, huddled bodies sharing heat. Clothing wasn't the first solution to cold. It was one of the last. So why did it eventually happen at all? Anthropologist Ian Gilligan has spent years studying this exact question, and his answer reframes the whole story. Gilligan argues clothing wasn't invented because of harsh winters alone. It was invented because humans started migrating into places winters actually mattered. As populations pushed north, out of Africa and into colder latitudes in Europe and Asia, exposed skin stopped being survivable. Clothing became less of a comfort and more of a life-or-death technology. In other words, you didn't invent clothes because you got cold. You invented clothes because you got ambitious. You wanted new land, and the land demanded a price. You weren't the only species facing that price either. Neanderthals lived across cold parts of Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, and they clearly survived brutal winters without ever developing the fitted, sewn clothing your ancestors eventually built. Some researchers studying Neanderthal remains suggest they relied more heavily on stockier, heat-retaining bodies and simple draped hides rather than tailored garments. That difference might matter more than it first appears. When modern humans arrived in Europe carrying fitted, layered clothing technology, they could regulate their body temperature more efficiently, move further, hunt longer, and survive colder snaps than Neanderthals could manage with looser coverings. Some researchers have even proposed that this clothing gap, small as it sounds, may have given modern humans a quiet but real advantage during the period when Neanderthals eventually disappeared. A sewing needle sounds like a minor tool. It might have helped decide which species inherited an entire continent. Now here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. The earliest clothing wasn't fitted. It wasn't tailored. For an enormous stretch of history, it was simple draped hide, wrapped and tied, nothing like the shirts and pants you know today. Actual sewing needles, made from bone with a tiny-eyed hole for thread, don't show up in the archaeological record until around 40,000 years ago. Researchers working in Siberian sites have recovered these needles alongside evidence of tightly fitted, layered garments. That means for well over 100,000 years, humans wore clothing that was closer to a blanket with a knot than an outfit. Fitted clothing, the kind that traps warm air against skin instead of just blocking wind, is a relatively late invention. And it might be the single technology that let humans survive an ice age. Hide wasn't the only material humans reached for either. Long before woven cloth existed, some groups were already twisting plant fibers into cordage, using it to bind hides together, reinforce seams, and eventually experiment with early forms of weaving. Archaeologists working at sites in the Republic of Georgia have recovered twisted flax fibers dated to tens of thousands of years old, some showing signs of dying. That single detail matters more than it seems. It means humans weren't just wrapping themselves in whatever animal they'd killed that week. They were actively engineering materials, selecting plants for strength and flexibility, and choosing color on purpose. Clothing wasn't a passive byproduct of hunting. It was its own quiet industry, running in parallel with tool making and fire building, refined generation after generation by people who left no written record explaining exactly how they did it. Consider what those layers actually did for a hunting group moving through a landscape that could kill you in a single bad night. A draped hide wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. It needed to trap a thin cushion of warm air against skin, and it needed to survive being dragged through brush, soaked in river crossings, and slept in beside a dying fire. Early clothing was closer to gear than fashion. It was tested the way a tool is tested, through failure. A poorly wrapped hide meant frostbite. A well-wrapped one meant you woke up the next morning. Natural selection wasn't just shaping bodies anymore. It was shaping decisions, habits, and the small daily choices about how tightly to tie a strip of leather before sleep. Pause here and ask yourself something. What do you actually think clothing is for? If your instinct says warmth, you're only partly right. Clothing quickly became something else entirely. Anthropologists studying isolated societies have long noted that some groups wear almost no clothing even in cool climates, while others in warm climates wear elaborate coverings. That inconsistency is the clue. Clothing was never purely about temperature. It became about identity, status, group membership. Who belongs where? A hide dyed a certain color could mark a hunter who made a kill. A specific pattern could mark a clan. Clothing turned into a language before humans even had full written language to describe it. You were reading social signals off fabric 50,000 years before you could read a single word. And that's the twist most people never see coming. You think of clothes as protection from the world. Ancient humans increasingly used them as protection from each other's judgment, and as a way to announce exactly who they were before they said a single word. Sound familiar? Because you still do this every single day. You choose an outfit not just for temperature, but for what it says. A suit says one thing. Ripped jeans say another. A uniform erases individual identity on purpose, to say, I am part of something larger than myself. None of that is new. None of that is modern marketing. That instinct is old. Genuinely, deeply old. You're running software that was written before agriculture, before cities, before the wheel. There's another layer here worth sitting with. Psychologist and researcher Solomon Asch's classic conformity experiments in the 1950s revealed how powerfully humans adjust their behavior based on group signals, even signals as small as what other people around them are doing. Clothing operates on that same nervous system. You dress partly for warmth, and partly because some ancient part of your brain is still asking silently, does this signal that I belong? Every outfit is a tiny negotiation between comfort and belonging, and you make that negotiation without even noticing. Color entered the picture early, and it changed everything about what clothing could say. Archaeologists have found traces of ochre, a natural red-brown pigment, on animal hides and tools going back tens of thousands of years. Once humans figured out how to color fabric and skins, clothing stopped being just a barrier against wind. It became a canvas. A hunter marked with a rare pigment stood out instantly in a crowd. A specific dye, hard to source or hard to make, signaled access to trade networks other groups couldn't reach. Long before coins or currency existed, color on cloth may have functioned as one of the earliest forms of visible wealth. You didn't need to ask who had traveled furthest or traded hardest. You could just look. That single shift, color as status, never really left human behavior. It just changed materials. Purple dye in the ancient Mediterranean world was so difficult to produce that it became reserved almost exclusively for royalty. A tradition so entrenched the color itself became a symbol of power for centuries. You can draw a straight line from a hunter proudly wearing rare ochre, to an emperor draped in imperial purple, to a modern shopper reaching for a specific luxury logo, instead of an identical unbranded version. The material changes. The instinct underneath it does not. Clothing also quietly reorganized how ancient groups related to each other, long before anything resembling formal government existed. Once garments could signal skill, rank, or access to distant trade goods, they created a visible hierarchy inside groups that had previously judged each other mostly by physical strength or hunting success alone. A skilled toolmaker with no particular size or speed advantage could still wear evidence of their value: a well-crafted hide, a rare bead, a specific pattern of stitching passed down through a family line. Clothing let status detach itself from raw physical ability for the first time. That single shift may have opened space for entirely new kinds of people to matter within a group, not just the strongest hunter, but the best maker, the most connected trader, the most careful artisan. Now think about layering itself. It's one of the most quietly brilliant inventions your ancestors ever produced. A single thick hide traps some warmth, but multiple thinner layers trap pockets of air between them, and trapped air insulates far better than solid material alone. Ancient humans in extreme cold environments figured this out through trial, error, and freezing nights, long before anyone understood the physics behind it. You do the exact same thing today when you throw a t-shirt under a sweater under a coat. You're not inventing anything. You're repeating a discovery that's tens of thousands of years old, dressed in modern fabric. There's a physical reason fitted, layered clothing mattered so much more than loose draped hide, and it's worth understanding plainly. Heat escapes a body constantly through convection, through moving air stripping warmth off skin. Loose hide lets cold air sneak in at every gap, every movement, every gust. Fitted clothing seals those gaps. It traps still air close to skin, and still air barely moves heat at all. That single shift from loose wrap to fitted seam likely made the difference between surviving an ice age and not surviving it. Researchers examining sites in Siberia and Central Europe have connected the timing of needle technology directly to the coldest stretches of the last glacial period. When temperatures dropped hardest, sewing appears in the record almost immediately after. That's not a coincidence. That's necessity forcing invention the same way it always has. Now think about what this meant for where humans could actually go. Without fitted, insulating clothing, entire regions of the planet were simply off limits. Siberia, Northern Europe, the high Arctic. These weren't places you could wander into wearing a loose hide and hope for the best. Clothing functioned as a kind of portable climate, a small pocket of Africa you carried on your own skin into landscapes that would otherwise kill you within hours. Every migration into a colder region was really a bet that clothing technology had caught up to the environment. Sometimes that bet failed and groups vanished from the record. Sometimes it worked and an entire new continent opened up to human life. Here's a question worth sitting with. If clothing started as pure survival and slowly became identity, status, and belonging, what does that say about what you're actually doing every morning when you get dressed? You might tell yourself you're just choosing something practical. But somewhere underneath, that decision is the same ancient instinct that once decided who got extra hide because they made the best kill, or who got marked as an outsider because their coverings looked wrong. You are not just dressing your body. You're speaking a language that predates language. And maybe that's the real reason clothing spread so fast once it existed, and never once reversed. It wasn't just insulation. It was communication. It let strangers instantly understand rank, role, and belonging without exchanging a single word, which mattered enormously once human groups grew too large for everyone to personally know everyone else. Clothing became a shortcut for trust in an increasingly crowded world. That shortcut still runs your life today, every time you size someone up in half a second based on what they're wearing. Think too about what clothing did to the idea of privacy itself. A body wrapped in hide is a body partly hidden, and hiding invites curiosity. Some anthropologists have argued that once humans began covering themselves habitually, nakedness itself changed meaning. It stopped being neutral. It became a state you moved in and out of on purpose, a thing you could reveal or withhold. That single shift rippled into how humans thought about modesty, intimacy, and even shame, categories that may not have existed in the same way before fabric came between skin and the world. A single practical invention, meant to keep hunters from freezing, ended up reshaping something as intimate as how a person understands their own body. Zoom out far enough, and clothing starts to look like one of the quiet inventions that built civilization itself, standing right alongside fire and language. It let humans occupy nearly every climate on the planet. It let strangers coordinate instantly through visual signals, instead of long conversations. It let humans mark rank, trade, ceremony, and belonging onto their own skin without a single spoken word. And it did all of that starting from something as unglamorous as a scrap of hide wrapped tight against a cold night, 170,000 years ago, by someone who was simply trying not to die before morning. Fast forward to right now, to your closet, to the pile of clothes you own that you never even wear. That pile is not a modern accident. It's an ancient instinct running completely unchecked. For most of human history, clothing was scarce, difficult to make, and deeply meaningful. A single garment could take a season to produce, so every piece you owned mattered. Today, clothing is cheap, abundant, and disposable, produced in factories at a pace your ancestors could never have imagined. But the part of your brain evaluating each outfit hasn't caught up to that abundance. It still treats every choice like it matters, like a hunter deciding whether to wear the marked hide or leave it behind. That mismatch between an ancient signaling instinct and a modern world of endless options might explain why choosing an outfit can feel oddly stressful even when, logically, it shouldn't matter at all. So tonight, when you pull a shirt over your head without thinking, notice it. Notice how automatic it feels. Notice how little you question it. That automation isn't laziness. It's inheritance. It's 170,000 years of trial, migration, invention, and social signaling, compressed into a 2-second habit you do half asleep in the dark. You didn't just put on clothes. You put on the same choice your ancestors risked freezing nights and unfamiliar land to figure out. And somewhere in that fabric is a message you're still sending, whether you meant to send it or not.